Welcome to Season 2 of Minding the Gap, Conversations on Gender. As global gender equality decreases, it is critical to share lessons as we work to turn the tide. From migration to sustainability and politics, we're exploring topics where gender is often overlooked, but inspiring stories emerge. You can listen to the entire series, including the first season, on all the major podcasting platforms, as well as our website at ecdpm.org.
Different voices and different perspectives add to the conversation and help us question some of these decisions that are being made around how we prioritize interventions, how we think about what kind of security actually matters, whose security matters, and what the role of the state is in addressing these different forms of violence.
Today, we're going to talk about gender and the prevention and countering of violent extremism, how and why women play distinct roles in these processes, and why it's important to consider gender in counterterrorism and prevention initiatives. My guest today is Alexandra Deer. Alexandra is the acting head of the Human Rights Section and gender coordinator at the UN Security Council Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, CTED, based in New York. Welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Sophie. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Alexandra, you work at the CTED. Could you tell us a bit more about what CTED does and how gender features in your work? And what are some of the key issues that you focus on at the moment with regards to gender and counterterrorism and prevention?
Sure. So CTED, so the UN Security Council Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, long name, so CTED for short, is an expert body that is supporting the work of the UN Security Council and its Counterterrorism Committee on all counterterrorism-related matters. And then to also bring it to the gender question, it wasn't part of the initial effort to address terrorism, but around 2015, the Council actually adopted a resolution that explicitly asked for the integration of counterterrorism efforts with the Women, Peace and Security agenda and to mainstream gender in all efforts to counter and prevent terrorism and violent extremism.
So your position was created in 2015, which is 15 years after the adoption of the first UN Security Council resolution on women, peace and security, which shows that also the thinking and sort of understanding of gender and what it means in the prevention and countering of violent extremism, terrorism, but also more widely peace and security changes or challenges has really evolved. Could you tell us a bit more in your position how you've seen the perception and understanding of the role of women and girls change over the last 2 decades and specifically also more since 2015?
The first thing to note is that for policymakers, this was a new issue, and for many, it actually didn't seem obvious at all that you would consider gender in this area. While for violent extremist groups, actually, gender has been very much part and parcel of their ideologies and operations, and for a long time. And so what we have seen in terms of what role gender plays is that it is a very important tool in how these groups actually appeal to and recruit both men and women. And so how they design very tailored and targeted narratives that appeal to men and women differently, how they look at gender dynamics and gender grievances and are able to appeal to those when they try to get individuals to join their cause and their groups. So, for example, if you look at the kind of discrimination and marginalization that many women experience in the societies in which they live, and how these groups then often come in and actually project a message of empowerment that they promise to these women. in the same way that when they try to appeal to men, they understand that men in many societies experience gendered expectations and pressure in terms of what it means to be a real man. And very often that is tied to being able to have a family, be the provider for that family, and that is how you attain social status as a man. Now, if you look at many contexts where young men in particular are actually struggling to attain that status, they struggle to get a decent education, to find employment, and to therefore be able to be that provider for a family. And so again, we see these groups very deliberately construct a message that says, well, we are giving you an alternative pathway towards attaining manhood. You know, it's by projecting a particular notion of masculinity that unfortunately is then often tied to violence. They then say you can be a member of this group, a fighter, you will therefore have this status as a man. And so they play with these ideas, with these very gendered ideas, and use them very, very effectively. We also see that gender plays an important role in terms of how these groups, how they operate, how they assign gendered roles within the group, how they enforce gendered norms and gendered hierarchies, not only within the group, but also in cases where they control communities or territory, and the kind of gendered norms they enforce in that context. In terms of the tactics that they use, for example, the use of sexual and gender-based violence by many of these groups. So all of that to say that violent extremist groups themselves have a very clear and I think often very intuitive understanding of the importance of gender. And so they're able to use it to their advantage and for their purposes. Whereas the policy community, the counterterrorism community, unfortunately, has been rather late to that recognition, and still until today, a lot of time is being spent on very theoretical discussions around like, well, does gender actually matter or not? Um, Whereas, you know, these groups are getting on with their business and they are incorporating gender into this, and so I think we are still catching up.
Thank you very much also for bringing up the masculinities issue, which I agree with you. We also had an episode on that in the first season, because we also felt on the basis of our work that this was still something that needed more attention and that is often not included when talking about gender, peace and security, countering and the prevention of violent extremism, where it's often about women and girls and not necessarily about the broad spectrum of gender, and how in humanitarian action, humanitarian crisis, also gender roles shift and change. And it's very interesting to hear also how what you said about how violent extremist groups intuitively play into this. They're on the ground, they're part of the societies of the communities, and they seem to be picking this up and using this very much on a day-to-day basis. You also worked as the UN Women's Regional Advisor on Peace, Security, Humanitarian Action in the Middle East and North Africa. Could you give us an example of how policymakers, humanitarian actors, maybe as well, tried to apply a better understanding of gender dynamics in their programming? Maybe examples of best practices or of examples of how success stories were achieved of trying to take a broader and more holistic gender understanding and trying to fight and prevent violent extremism?
Yeah, I think one of the important good practices to promote in this area, and a lot of the work that we were doing in the region, in the MENA region, is really to engage more women-led civil society organizations, and really making sure that we bring them and their voices um, into security policy decision making, and that their perspectives on what security looks like and what the needs of their communities are, that these are really heard and incorporated into the responses. And so we had many programs that were focused on dialogue with these women, also connecting them with each other, creating networks of women peace builders, women human rights defenders, women civil society activists, and really trying to create ways of empowering them and learning from their very rich experiences. One of the most striking things for me was the work that we did with local women mediators from across the region, and looking at the very important successes that they have often had at the local level, mediating local conflicts, being able to negotiate humanitarian access across lines, and many sort of stories that I think we have very limited awareness of, that very often are not being widely reported and publicized. And um, the importance of a lot of that work lies in the fact that across the various violent conflicts that we see in that region, unfortunately, the peace processes are very much stuck. There is limited progress in what we call the high level track one political processes that we have. And so it's often very difficult to not lose hope um, in terms of bringing about an improvement of the situation. And what we discovered through our engagement with these women is that actually, if you don't look at peace just at that top level, but you really break it down, you go to the local level, to the community level, and you see that there are actually pockets and examples of where um, progress can be achieved, where conflicts can be resolved, um, and that it is actually important to build that peace from the ground up rather than just coming with the top down approach, and that actually um, women in their communities have had many of these successes and do engage in these efforts, and that also, in addition, helps to um, helps to also change the narrative around women's roles, which is still very much that they don't engage in these processes, that they don't have leadership roles, that they are confined to the domestic space and so forth. And here you have concrete examples of how they are actually within their communities, often playing these very important roles.
Yeah, and I really liked what you said about civil society organizations, because I do think also that those are not the typical or the first type of organizations that I think many would think about to engage with when thinking, for example, about security sector reform or sort of security interventions in general. And yeah, women, there are a lot of women-led civil society organizations. And then on top of that, these female leaders, local organizations are not always structured formally necessarily as civil society organizations, but in a way that is maybe more informal, but nonetheless impactful for their local communities. I wanted to ask a question also about prevention and how to design sort of successful prevention strategies that bring in some of the topics that you or the issues that you brought forward, involving female leaders, local leaders, but also understanding masculinities and the role that men and also boys play in the prevention strategies and interventions. Could you tell us a bit about that based on your experience?
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I want to tie in a couple of things that you said there, because I think this issue of the role that and the contribution that women's civil society organizations can bring to this security space is really important. And in the area of countering terrorism, Um, I think it's important to say that mainstreaming gender within that is also about bringing in these different perspectives and opening up that space that remains very heavily securitized, that remains very closed to civil society actors and to engagement with a wider range of different stakeholders and different voices. And so meaningfully integrating gender in this regard is not just about looking at the role of women within violent extremism and some of the issues that we started our conversation with, but it is really also about transforming how we do counterterrorism and how we think about the prevention of violent extremism. And so these um, getting this wider range of voices and having a more inclusive policy space and policy process is also very, very central and something that meaningful gender mainstreaming entails. And so on that, and this links to your second question of how we think about prevention and how we think about really the idea of security at a more fundamental level. This is something that is really important in the sense that if you engage with many of these women led grassroots organizations, you will see that it changes the perspective um, and brings to the table a different conversation around what security actually is and whose security we're talking about and prioritizing. And so moving away from a traditional hard notion of security, of state security, to what is called a human security approach. And I think it's important, we can talk about this in sort of very theoretical terms around definitions and concepts and so forth. But going back to your important emphasis on the role of women civil society organizations, I want to give you a very concrete example of recent engagement that I've had with women civil society organizations on a very recent trip. I just came back last week from a seated mission to a country in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a country that thankfully so far has been spared from any terrorist incidents, but where there are efforts to make sure that and there is a certain mobilization around ensuring preparedness in the case that um, individuals would come across borders and perpetrate terrorist acts, and there's quite a lot of nervousness around that potential risk. But at the same time, when we engaged with these women civil society organizations that are working on the ground within different communities, their emphasis was a very different one. They said, of course, prevention is important, but at the same time, how we think about prevention is not at all obvious, in the sense that we also have a lot of ongoing problems. We have existing violence within our society as it is. And that includes, for example, worrying levels of gender based violence that is affecting and leading to suffering among a significant part of our population. And so that should be first and foremost our priority. And there should be sufficient resources and a sufficient concern around this type of violence, based also on an understanding that if you are able to address these kinds of forms of existing violence and existing conflict, then that is also contributing to resilience and prevention of violent extremism. And so you don't necessarily have to label it as working concretely on the prevention of violent extremism. It is about creating and addressing or creating conditions and addressing sort of what we call the conditions conducive to violent extremism in a much more holistic manner and in a truly preventative sense, by ensuring a greater sense of security among the population and addressing all segments of the population, and therefore also prioritizing the safety and security of women, and not seeing that as a lesser form of violence or as a less important form of violence, and therefore concentrating resources on this sort of very narrow and very securitized understanding of what the threat to this society is. So I thought this was a very powerful and very concrete example of how um, different voices and different perspectives add to the conversation and help us question some of these decisions that are being made around how we prioritize interventions, how we think about what kind of security actually matters, whose security matters, and what the role of the state is in addressing these different forms of violence that exist within society. And this is another thing that is very important, and that we always emphasize, and that I think many women activists also emphasize, is to think about violence on a spectrum, and to understand that these different forms of violence within society are interrelated and enable one another. And so it's not enough to just look at the far end of extremist violence, but that actually effective prevention starts much, much earlier. And you have to think about these different forms of violence that exist and how to address them.
That's really interesting, Alexandra, and it goes back to what you said at the beginning as well, of the importance of integrating the whole of the women, peace, and security agenda, which talks about protection, but also participation, recovery. So the whole spectrum of activities, if you want to more effectively prevent and counter violent extremism, and avoid that what you said at the end is that you deal with the incidents at the very end, the extreme forms of violence, but that you are equipped to observe the very first signs of escalating violence at the local level, at the household level, as a sign of, there's a need to jump in here and to invest in prevention early on, instead of dealing with it at the very end. I wanted to go back to your role at CTED, and the engagement that you have with the UN Security Council. Where do you see, in what you elaborated on, and sort of the key trends and dynamics, and the work that still needs to be done in trying to really understand what gender mainstreaming means and how important it is? Where do you see most room for improvement, or let's say most room for political action by UN Security Council member states, but also the UN system more generally? If you could tell us a little bit about that.
So I think, of course, it's no secret that the current geopolitical environment is a difficult and a tense one. And so, of course, at the level of the council, we are getting these questions: what can be done in this context, and where do you see room for further action on issues around gender, women, peace and security, human rights, and countering terrorism? And I would say to that we actually, in terms of having that normative framework that the council gives us, and that we actually have a robust framework that is already in place. We have 10 Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security. We have numerous counterterrorism resolutions that speak to the need of ensuring gender sensitive approaches in counterterrorism efforts. And I want to emphasize that the vast majority of these resolutions have been adopted unanimously. So there is international consensus on these principles. And so I think we don't need necessarily more resolutions and more high level declarations. What we really need to see is implementation, is action on the ground, is making sure that these international commitments are actually being lived up to. And I think that in that regard, the biggest challenge that we have is around resources. And the fact that, again, the gender, human rights, and civil society related work remains the most underfunded work that we have. And so that this rhetorical and normative commitment that exists to these issues is not being matched by resources, by funding. And that is also in my engagement with civil society organizations and women's organizations. That is uniformly the message that comes across. We have just very recently concluded a series of consultations with civil society organizations, many of them women-led, who really work at the front lines of providing services and assistance to victims and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence committed by terrorist groups. And they really do incredibly important and impressive work under very difficult circumstances, really providing the full range of support that these victims need in terms of medical assistance, psychosocial support, helping them access justice, advocating for reparations, etc., etc. Really, really essential work. Often in contexts where terrorism coexists with other forms of conflict and violence. And so we are looking at really multiple layers of overlapping trauma and suffering. You're often looking at remote areas with limited state reach. And so really these grassroots organizations are often the only ones providing these kinds of support and services. And we talked to groups from many different parts of the world. And again, uniformly, the message was, we are committed to what we are doing, but we are really struggling because we do not have the support, we do not have the resources, we do not have predictable, sustainable funding, and we are struggling. And so this, again, I want to bring this back to the international commitment that exists. There are several Security Council resolutions with concrete language that says victims of this type of violence are entitled and should receive this full range of assistance, support, and recognition. And yet, you speak to those who are providing that to these victims and survivors, and their main challenge is having sufficient resources to be able to do that work. So again, it's this implementation, the real life action that should be happening, and that is impeded by resource allocation that does not match that that normative international commitment. So I think the biggest progress that we could achieve is through addressing these issues rather than through more policy documents and commitments and statements.
Thank you, Alexandra. So, Anna, and if I just wrap up what you said on the last point, is that we're in a way lucky that the sort of the set of UN Security Council resolutions is already in place. We see a growing pushback against sort of, making progress on gender issues. We see increased geopolitical competition. So at least in a way, you could say the framework is there and we can't backtrack on that. But that doesn't mean that the discussions on resources and implementation will become any easier in the next few years. And I guess that's also an additional call to sort of also contribute to the discussions on the new agenda for peace and the UN Summit of the Future, which is coming up, which could be an additional moment also to, to reassess the actual commitments and the resources that are being allocated to this. So I think also all the more important to keep having these conversations and putting sort of the real life experiences and the role that these civil society organizations on the ground and female leaders on the ground the important work that they do to keep putting this on the agenda and to keep talking about this in support of their work. On the basis of that, Alexandra, thank you so much for the conversation today on this important topic. We talked about masculinities and making sure that we look at the whole range of gender issues, not just women and girls, but also the position and role of boys and men in the prevention and countering of violent extremism. We talked about the important role of local leaders, women leaders, women mediators, and also civil society organizations, and how they need to be taken on board much, much more when talking about prevention and countering violent extremism. And lastly, what you mentioned, resources need to match the commitments and the international framework and the consensus that actually exists on preventing and countering violent extremism and peace and security initiatives. So thank you, Alexandra, so much for this conversation today.
Thank you, Sophie. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.